I mean, who did you vote for privately? In the deep, deep inner twit recesses of your redundant mind?
For decades, people wondered what really existed between Judi Dench and Maggie Smith. Were they close friends, secret rivals, or was there something about their relationship that the public never fully understood? They teased each other, competed in the same world, and sometimes spoke with the kind of sharp humor that made outsiders wonder if there was bad blood behind the smiles. But after Maggie Smith's death, Judi Dench gave the public a moment they could not easily explain away. She tried to speak about her old friend, and suddenly, the words stopped. What happened next revealed more than years of interviews ever could. The rumor that never went away. For more than 6 decades, Judi Dench and Maggie Smith were 2 of the biggest names in British acting. They became famous for different reasons, played very different characters, and built careers that few performers could ever match. But there was one thing they had in common from the very beginning. They knew each other long before the awards, the famous films, the television hits, and the titles of Dame. Their story began in the world of British theater, where both women were still young actresses trying to prove themselves.
They met at the Old Vic in London during the late 1950s. They shared a dressing room, worked in the same productions, and experienced the pressure of being young women in a difficult acting industry. Judi later remembered those early days with laughter, while Maggie was known for having a much sharper and more forgetful version of the same memories. That early connection mattered, because when 2 people grow together before fame changes everything, they see sides of each other that the public never gets to see. They see the nervous moments, the bad performances, the missed opportunities, the jokes made backstage, and the moments when someone wonders if they are really good enough. Judi and Maggie had all of that history. Yet as their careers grew, something else happened. People started comparing them. Both were extraordinary actresses. Both could handle comedy and drama. Both became major figures on stage and screen. Both continued working at a time when the entertainment industry often treated older actresses as if their best years were already behind them. That made their relationship easy for outsiders to misunderstand. When 2 famous actresses are constantly placed beside each other, people naturally start asking questions.
Who was better? Who got the bigger role? Who was more respected? Who was more successful? And perhaps most importantly, did they secretly compete with each other? There was some competition. But competition is not the same thing as hatred. In fact, the evidence points in a very different direction. People close to the actresses describe them as longtime friends who genuinely enjoyed making each other laugh. Their playful arguments became part of their friendship. In the 2015 film, The Second Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, their characters even joked about who would die first, showing the kind of dark humor that came naturally between them. That kind of relationship can look strange from the outside. 2 powerful actresses can tease each other so sharply that viewers think something must be wrong. But sometimes, the people who know each other best are also the people who can joke with each other the hardest. Judi and Maggie seemed to understand that language. They did not need to constantly tell the world how much they cared about each other. Their friendship had already survived decades. They went through major career changes, they worked apart, they worked together again. They appeared in films such as A Room with a View, Ladies in Lavender, and The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, and later shared the screen again in its sequel. They also worked together on stage, including David Hare's The Breath of Life. That is why the rumors surrounding them were always more complicated than a simple story about 2 actresses who disliked each other. The truth was much more human. They could challenge each other without destroying each other. They could joke without being enemies, and they could spend time apart without losing the connection built when they were young. But then, in September 2024, everything changed. Maggie Smith died at the age of 89. Suddenly, there was no more teasing, no more backstage jokes, no more chance for another reunion. And when Judi Dench was asked about her friend just days later, the woman who had spent a lifetime performing in front of audiences found herself struggling to find the right words. That moment would change the way many people looked at their relationship, because Judi did not need to announce that Maggie had been important to her. Her reaction said it. And the next part of the story reveals why losing Maggie was not simply the loss of another famous actress.
It was the loss of someone who had been there before the world knew either of them. Someone who had seen Judi before the fame, before the awards, before the title of dame. And that is where the real story begins, where Judi Dench and Maggie Smith really began. Long before the rumors, before the awards, and before millions of people knew their names, Judi Dench and Maggie Smith were simply two young actresses trying to make it. And that is the part of their story that often gets forgotten. They did not meet as two famous stars competing for attention. They met when neither woman knew how far her career would go. They were working in the demanding world of British theater, where talent alone was never enough. You needed discipline, you needed confidence, and sometimes you needed someone beside you who understood exactly what you were going through. For Judi and Maggie, that person became each other. Their early connection grew around London's Old Vic.
They shared the same theater world, worked around many of the same people, and experienced the pressures that came with trying to build a serious acting career. Maggie later remembered that they had gone back a long way, and that simple idea tells us something important. Their friendship was not created by fame. Fame came later. The friendship came first. That difference matters because it helps explain why their relationship could survive so many years of public attention. Imagine being a young actress and walking into a theater where every performance feels like a test. One night you might receive praise. The next night someone else might get the role you wanted. There was no guarantee that success would last. And for women in the theater world, the road could become even harder with age. Judi and Maggie were growing in an industry where actresses were often compared, judged, and placed into categories. Every new role could change the direction of a career. So yes, there were reasons for competition, but competition was not automatically personal. In fact, their shared struggle may have been one of the strongest things holding them together.
They understood what it felt like to lose a role. They understood what it felt like to walk onto a stage knowing everyone was judging you, and they understood the strange pressure of being compared with another talented woman. That is where their humor became important. Judi and Maggie were not known for being overly sentimental with each other. Their friendship had a different style. They joked, they teased, they made sharp comments. They could laugh at things that other people might take personally. To an outsider, that could look like hostility, but to two people who had known each other for decades, it could mean something completely different. It could mean trust. You do not tease someone like that if you are afraid they will misunderstand every word. You do it when you know the person well enough to understand where the line is. And Judi and Maggie seemed to know that line. Their friendship also survived something that destroys many relationships: success. As the years passed, both women became major stars. Judi Dench became known around the world for her powerful performances on stage and screen.
Maggie Smith built her own extraordinary reputation, becoming famous for roles that showed both her sharp comedy and dramatic strength. Then came the awards, the major films, the television hits, the international fame. But underneath all of it was the same history. They had known each other before any of that existed. That gave their relationship a special kind of balance. Neither woman had to impress the other. Neither had to prove that she belonged. They already knew. They had seen each other when the careers were still uncertain. They had watched each other grow. They knew the person behind the public image. And that is something fame cannot easily replace. Years later, when audiences saw them together, the chemistry often felt natural because it was. They were not pretending to understand each other. They already did. Their friendship even became part of their professional lives. They appeared together in several projects, giving audiences the chance to see two legendary actresses sharing the screen. But even then, their relationship was not simply about acting. It was about history. Every joke carried years behind it. Every look could come from memories that the audience knew nothing about. Every teasing comment came from a friendship that had started long before cameras were following them. This is also why the rumor of a secret rivalry became so interesting to the public. People saw two women at the top of their profession and assumed they must have been fighting for the same crown. But real life was not that simple. Judi and Maggie did not need one person to lose for the other to win. They could admire each other and still compete. They could challenge each other and still care. They could joke about each other and still stand together. That is a much more interesting story than a simple feud. Because the strongest friendships are not always quiet. Sometimes they are loud. Sometimes they are sarcastic. Sometimes they are full of arguments and laughter. And sometimes the people closest to you are the people who know exactly how to make you laugh when nobody else can. For Judi and Maggie, that bond lasted for decades. But there was another reason their connection became so powerful. Both women were about to face the same challenge that many actresses feared: getting older in an industry obsessed with youth.
Instead of disappearing, however, they did something unexpected. They became even more important. Their age did not end their careers. It became part of their power. And as the world watched them rise higher and higher, the supposed rivalry between them was about to take on a completely different meaning. The rivalry that may have made them stronger. The women behind the public image. To understand why Judi Dench's reaction to Maggie Smith became so emotional, you have to look beyond the famous faces. Because the public knew Maggie Smith as the sharp-tongued woman who could silence a room with one sentence. They knew her as Professor McGonagall in Harry Potter. They knew her as Violet Crawley in Downton Abbey. They knew the raised eyebrow, the perfect timing, the unforgettable one-liners. But Judi Dench knew something the audience could not see. She knew Maggie before those characters became part of her identity. She knew the woman behind the performances, and that difference matters. Fame has a strange effect on people. The public can watch an actor for decades and still know very little about who that person really is. We see interviews, we see red carpets, we see characters.
We hear funny stories, but we rarely see the private struggles that happen when the cameras are gone. Maggie Smith was especially good at keeping that private world protected. Her public image was often connected to her sharp humor and strong personality. She could appear almost impossible to intimidate. But strength on the outside does not mean a person never feels pain. Maggie's life included difficult personal moments. Her first marriage to actor Robert Stevens ended after years of problems, and her second husband, playwright Beverly Cross, died in 1998. These experiences were not always visible to audiences. Instead, Maggie continued working. She continued performing. She continued making people laugh. And perhaps that was part of what Judi understood so well. Judi had also experienced deep personal loss. Her husband, actor Michael Williams, died in 2001. So both women understood something that most people around them could never fully understand. They knew what it meant to lose someone you love, and then wake up the next morning and continue living. There is no award for that. There is no standing ovation. There is no script telling you what to say. You simply keep going.
And sometimes another person who has lived through something similar can understand your silence better than anyone else. That may have been one of the strongest hidden parts of Judi and Maggie's friendship. They did not need to explain everything. They had lived long enough to understand the things that words could not always fix. Their friendship also showed how different public image can be from private reality. Maggie could play a cold character without actually being cold. Judi could play a powerful character without always feeling powerful. Actors spend their lives becoming other people, but sometimes the world starts confusing the actor with the character. That happened to Maggie often. Her sharp humor became part of her public image. People began expecting her to be funny all the time. But Judi knew there was much more to her. There was vulnerability, there was loyalty, there was history, and there was a friendship that had survived more than half a century. That history became especially meaningful as both women grew older. They had watched the acting world change. They had watched younger generations arrive. They had watched some of their friends disappear.
And they had continued working while the world kept moving. That is something only longtime friends can truly understand. A person who has known you for 60 years remembers versions of you that everyone else has forgotten. They remember when you were young. They remember your early dreams. They remember your mistakes. They remember the roles that changed your life. And they remember the people who were there before fame. That is why losing such a person can feel like losing part of yourself. You are not only losing a friend, you are losing a witness to your past. And for Judi, Maggie was exactly that. Maggie had been there before Judi became one of Britain's most respected actresses. She had known Judi during the difficult years when neither woman knew what the future would bring. She had seen the career grow. She had seen Judi become famous around the world. And Judi had done the same with Maggie. That kind of shared history creates a bond that is almost impossible to explain to someone who has never experienced it. It also explains why the old rumors about rivalry never told the full story.
People saw two successful actresses and wanted a simple explanation, but the reality was much richer. They could be competitive, they could tease each other, they could disagree, and they could still care deeply about each other. Their relationship did not need to fit into one simple box. It was friendship with history, respect with competition, humor mixed with honesty, and beneath all of it was loyalty. Then came the moment that changed everything. On September 27, 2024, Maggie Smith died at the age of 89. For the world, it was the death of a legendary actress. For Judi Dench, it was something much more personal. It was the loss of someone who had been part of her life for decades. And only days later, Judi was asked to speak about Maggie. She tried, but something happened that no prepared interview could hide. Judi became emotional. At the Cheltenham Literature Festival, she was speaking about Maggie and another friend she had recently lost. When she began talking about Maggie, the emotion became difficult to contain. For someone who had spent a lifetime performing, Judi suddenly had no performance left. No character, no clever line, no easy answer. Just grief.
And that moment was powerful because it gave people a glimpse behind the public image. For decades, audiences had watched Judi and Maggie make people laugh. They had watched them perform. They had watched them trade wit and play unforgettable characters. But now there was nothing to entertain anyone. There was only the pain of losing an old friend. And suddenly, the old question about rivalry seemed almost meaningless. Who cared who got the better role? Who cared who was more famous? Who cared who had won more awards? When someone who has shared decades of your life disappears, those things become very small. Judi's tears seemed to say what years of interviews never could. Maggie mattered, not because she was famous, not because she was a great actress, but because she was Maggie, an old friend, a familiar face from another time, a person who had walked beside Judi through a huge part of her life. And that brings us to the most emotional question of this entire story. If their relationship had really been built on jealousy and hatred, why did losing Maggie hurt Judi so deeply?
The answer may have been sitting in front of the public all along. The rivalry was never the whole story. The friendship was. For years, people looked at Judi Dench and Maggie Smith and saw a competition. Two legendary actresses, two powerful careers, two women from the same generation, and two names that seemed impossible to separate. But what if the rivalry was never the real problem? What if it was actually one of the reasons they became better? Judi and Maggie worked in an industry where opportunities could be limited, especially for women. When one actress received a major role, another actress might lose her chance. When one performance received huge praise, comparisons quickly followed. That kind of pressure can turn professional competition into something personal. But Judi and Maggie appeared to handle it differently. They knew the other woman was talented, and that meant neither could simply ignore the competition. If Maggie gave an incredible performance, Judi knew she had to bring her best. If Judi received praise for her role, Maggie knew exactly how strong the person standing beside her could be. That might sound uncomfortable, but sometimes competition pushes talented people to work harder.
The danger comes when competition becomes jealousy, and that is where their story becomes interesting. There is little evidence that their professional competition destroyed their friendship. Instead, their long history suggests that they could admire one another while still having their own ambitions. That is not unusual among great performers. Actors spend their careers being judged. They are compared by critics, compared by audiences, compared by directors, compared by awards, and sometimes compared with their closest friends. Judi and Maggie simply happened to be two women who reached the highest level of the profession at almost the same time. That made comparisons unavoidable. But the public often wants simple answers: friends or enemies, love or hate, rivals or best friends. Real relationships rarely work that way. Judi and Maggie could be competitive without being cruel. They could disagree without becoming enemies. And they could tease each other without destroying the trust between them. That last part was especially important. Their humor became almost like a private language. Instead of giving each other long, emotional speeches, they could use one sharp joke. Instead of saying, "I care about you," they could make fun of each other. Instead of becoming uncomfortable during difficult moments, they could laugh. That kind of friendship can be difficult for outsiders to understand, especially when both people are famous. The public sees the words. The friends know the history behind those words. A sentence that sounds cold to a stranger can sound completely different to someone who has known you for 60 years. And Judi and Maggie had that kind of history. Their friendship had survived changing careers, changing fashions, changing audiences, and the enormous pressure of fame. That does not happen by accident. It requires something deeper than simply enjoying someone's company. It requires respect. And respect was clearly one of the strongest parts of their connection. Judi respected Maggie's talent. Maggie respected Judi's talent. Neither woman needed to pretend the other was less successful. They had both already proven themselves. This is why the idea of a secret feud is so much less interesting than what actually appears to have existed. Their relationship was complicated, but complicated does not mean broken. In fact, sometimes the strongest friendships are complicated because both people are strong enough to be honest. They do not always agree. They do not always praise each other.
They can challenge each other, and yet when something truly serious happens, the competition suddenly becomes unimportant. That would become painfully clear later, because there was one thing even their decades of professional success could not protect them from: time. Judi and Maggie had spent their lives watching people come and go. Friends passed away, colleagues retired, the theater changed, film changed, television changed, and eventually age began taking away the people they had known for most of their lives. Yet both women continued working. They refused to disappear simply because they were getting older. Maggie became one of the most recognizable faces of Harry Potter and Downton Abbey. Judi became internationally famous as M in the James Bond films. Instead of becoming less important with age, they became more respected. That was a quiet victory. The industry had spent years telling older women that their choices would become smaller. Judi and Maggie showed the opposite. Their experience made them more powerful. Their voices carried more weight. Their performances carried the memories of decades. And their friendship carried all of that history with it. But there was something even deeper beneath their professional success. Both women understood loss.
Both understood that fame does not protect anyone from heartbreak, and both had already experienced painful moments in their personal lives. That shared understanding would eventually bring them even closer, because when two people have spent decades watching the world change, they become more than colleagues. They become witnesses to each other's lives. Maggie knew Judi before she became the Judi Dench the world recognized. Judi knew Maggie before she became the Maggie Smith remembered by millions. They had seen the younger versions of each other. They had watched the careers grow. They had watched the victories, and they had seen the difficult moments too. That is something a new friendship cannot replace. You can meet someone today and become very close, but you cannot recreate 60 years of shared memories. And that is exactly why Maggie's final years carried such emotional weight for Judi. The woman she lost was not simply another actress. She was part of the story of Judi's own life. And when Maggie died, all those decades suddenly became memories. That is where the story takes a much darker turn.
Because the rumors about rivalry had always focused on what happened when these two women were together. But after Maggie was gone, Judi's reaction revealed something far more powerful. It was no longer about who got the better role. It was no longer about who was funnier. It was no longer about who had the bigger career. There was only one question left. What does it feel like to lose someone who has known you for most of your life? And Judi Dench's answer would not come through a dramatic speech. It would come through something much harder to fake: her tears.